Think about the last conversation that stayed with you, not necessarily the one where the most interesting things were said, the one where you felt most seen, most understood, where something in the exchange left you quieter, more settled, more connected to the person across from you than you were before. Now think about what made it feel that way. Try to isolate the specific thing. Was it the words? Sometimes, but often if you sit with it honestly, it was something harder to name. A quality of attention, a sense that the other person was genuinely, unhurriedly present with what you were saying, that they heard not just the content but something underneath it, that they understood you in a way that went past the surface of what you had actually put into words. What you were experiencing was emotional intelligence, not as a corporate buzzword, not as a personality trait you either have or you don't, but as a set of very specific, very learnable skills, skills that allow a person to read the emotional reality of a situation, of another human being, and of themselves, with a clarity and accuracy that changes the quality of every interaction they have. This audiobook is about those skills, where they come from, what they actually consist of, why some people seem to have them naturally and most people don't, and most importantly, how to develop them not as performance, not as technique, but as a genuine deepening of how you perceive and move through the world of other people. Because every person you have ever met is carrying something they have not fully said. Part 1. The two CONVRS. Every interaction between two human beings is actually two conversations happening simultaneously. The first conversation is the one you are aware of, the exchange of words, information, ideas, requests, responses, the explicit, conscious, verbal layer of communication that we tend to think of as the conversation. It is the part that gets remembered when you try to recount what was said, the part you could transcribe. The second conversation is the one most people are only dimly aware of, if they are aware of it at all. It runs beneath the words carried in the body, the face, the timing, the silences, the quality of eye contact, the slight hesitation before a particular answer, the way a posture shifts when a specific topic is raised. It is the emotional subtext, the unspoken language, and research consistently shows that when the two conversations are in conflict, when what someone says and what their body communicates are different, it is the second conversation that carries the truth. The psychologist Albert Mehrabian conducted studies in the 1960s that produced what became, in popular culture, the somewhat oversimplified claim that only 7% of communication is words. The actual finding is more nuanced than that. It applies specifically to the communication of feelings and attitudes. Not all communication, but the underlying observation is sound and has been replicated in many forms since. When we are communicating emotionally charged content, the nonverbal signals carry disproportionate weight. We are reading each other constantly, on channels we are not fully conscious of, forming impressions and making judgments and deciding how much we trust what someone is telling us based on information that never gets encoded into language at all. The emotionally intelligent person is someone who has become, through some combination of natural sensitivity, deliberate development, and lived experience, more conscious of the second conversation. They have learned to hold both streams of information simultaneously, to listen to the words and watch the body, to hear what is said and feel what is not, to notice the gap between the two, and to hold that gap with curiosity rather than judgment. This is not about suspicion. It is not about catching people in contradictions. It is about understanding, about meeting people where they actually are rather than where their words place them. Because here is something that becomes clear when you spend time genuinely observing. Human interaction. Most people are not being dishonest when their words and body tell different stories. They are being human. They are saying what they think they are supposed to say, or what they wish were true, or what they have not yet found the words or the safety or the self-awareness to say directly. The gap between what someone says and what their body shows is usually not deception. It is the distance between their conscious narrative and their felt experience. And that distance is one of the most important things a person can learn to navigate with care. The four channels of the second conversation are these: the face, particularly the micro-expressions that last less than a fifth of a second and reveal emotional states before the conscious mind can manage them. The body, posture, gesture, proximity, the orientation of the torso, the direction of the feet, the subtle changes in muscle tension that register comfort or threat or desire or withdrawal. The voice, not the words but the tone, pace, pitch, and prosody, the emotional color that language carries independent of its meaning. And the silence, the pauses, the hesitations, the moments where the absence of words contains more information than the words around it. We will come back to each of these, but first we need to understand something fundamental about why most people are not reading them well, and why it has nothing to do with intelligence. Part 2. Why most people stop, LISTNING. There is a quality that every genuinely emotionally intelligent person shares. It is not charisma. It is not warmth, though many of them are warm. It is not the ability to say the right thing at the right moment, though they often do. It is this: they are fully, unhurriedly present in conversation. They are not preparing their next sentence while you finish yours. They are not scanning the room. They are not managing their own emotional reaction to what you are saying, while simultaneously trying to track what you are saying. They are simply, completely there. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the most difficult things a human being can do, because the default mode of the human mind is not presence, it is narration. Research from Harvard psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert found that the human mind is wandering, not focused on what it is currently doing. Approximately 47% of the time, nearly half of our waking hours spent somewhere other than the present moment. And crucially, their data showed that this mental wandering was consistently associated with lower happiness, regardless of what the mind was wandering to. We are built to drift, and in conversation, that drift is extraordinarily costly. When you are drifting in a conversation, even slightly, even while still tracking the words, you are missing the second conversation entirely. The micro-expressions that last a fraction of a second, the slight change in vocal quality when a particular subject is mentioned, the pause that held something the words did not. These signals are fleeting, and they require a quality of attention that divided consciousness simply cannot provide. Most people are not poor listeners because they do not care. They are poor listeners because they are listening to themselves while someone else is speaking. There is a second reason that goes deeper still. Genuine listening, the kind that actually reads the emotional reality of another person, requires a temporary suspension of your own perspective, not a permanent one, not an abandonment of your own views or feelings, but a deliberate, conscious setting aside of your own frame long enough to genuinely inhabit someone else's, to ask not what do I think about what they are saying, but what is it like to be them saying this right now. This is psychologically uncomfortable in ways that are easy to underestimate, because your perspective, your frame, your internal narrative about how the world works and what things mean, these are not just opinions you hold at a comfortable distance. They are the structure through which you process reality. Temporarily setting them aside feels, to the nervous system, something like losing your footing, and so most people do not do it. They listen through their own frame, interpreting what they hear through the lens of their own experience, their own emotional history, their own assumptions about what the other person must be feeling and why. The result is a conversation where two people are present in the same room, but inhabiting entirely different realities, where what gets communicated is a pale, distorted version of what was actually meant, where both people leave feeling slightly or significantly less understood than they hoped to be. The shift begins with a deceptively simple practice. Before you respond in a conversation, before you formulate your point or your advice or your counterargument, ask yourself one question: do I actually know what this person is feeling right now? Not what I think they should be feeling, not what I would feel in their position, what they are feeling. And if the honest answer is not fully, then stay in the question a little longer before you move to the answer. Part 3. The anatomy of empathy. The word empathy is used so freely in modern culture that it has begun to blur at the edges. People use it to mean sympathy, to mean kindness, to mean the general quality of being a caring person. But empathy in the precise psychological sense is something more specific than any of those things. And understanding what it actually is and what it is not is essential to developing it deliberately. Empathy is the capacity to accurately perceive and understand the emotional state of another person, not to feel sorry for them, not to agree with them, not to merge with their emotional experience or lose your own, to perceive accurately, to understand genuinely, to know with some degree of reliability what it is actually like to be them in this moment. Psychologists distinguish between at least two forms of empathy that operate quite differently in the brain and in practice. Affective empathy is the form most people think of. The experience of feeling what another person feels, seeing someone in pain and feeling an echo of that pain in yourself. It is the empathy of resonance, mirroring. Research shows it is heavily mediated by the brain's mirror neuron systems, the neural architecture that fires both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action, giving your brain a direct experiential route into another person's state. Cognitive empathy is different. It is the capacity to understand another person's perspective, their emotional state, their motivations through thought rather than feeling. 2. Model their inner world accurately, without necessarily experiencing an emotional echo of it. This is the empathy of comprehension rather than resonance, and while it sounds less warm than affective empathy, research suggests it is actually more reliably useful in most interpersonal situations, because it can be deployed without the risk of emotional flooding, which is the point at which effective empathy stops being useful and starts becoming a problem. There is a crucial distinction that is easy to miss. Empathy is not the same as sympathy. Sympathy looks at someone's pain from a safe emotional distance and offers comfort from that distance. Empathy goes into the emotional reality of the other person and communicates from inside it. The difference in how it is received by the other person is enormous. Breen Brown, whose research on vulnerability and human connection has reached millions of people, offers a description that captures the distinction beautifully. Sympathy says, "That sounds really hard." Empathy says, "I know that place. Let me come in." The development of genuine empathy, the cognitive kind, stable enough to be available, even in difficult conversations, requires a practice that runs counter to one of the most deeply ingrained tendencies in human thinking, the tendency to make it about us. When someone tells you something painful, the mind's first move is almost always to locate a parallel in your own experience. "Oh, I know, when that happened to me I felt and." Before the sentence is finished, you are no longer inside their experience. You are back inside your own, using theirs as a doorway to something that is ultimately about you. This is not malicious. It is the mind's natural way of building connection, through recognition, through shared experience. But it has the effect, nearly every time, of subtly shifting the attention from their story to yours, and the person who is trying to be heard feels, in some slight but real way, less heard than before. The alternative requires catching that impulse, noticing the moment your mind moves toward your own experience and gently, deliberately returning to theirs, staying with the question, what is this like for them? Not what would it be like for me? What is it like for them? Given who they are, given what they carry, given everything I know and do not know about their particular life. It is a small redirection, but practiced consistently, it transforms the quality of your presence in conversation in ways that other people feel before they can name what is different about you. Part 4. How to read a person. Let us get specific, because emotional intelligence is not only a philosophical orientation, it is a set of practical perceptual skills, things you can actually learn to notice, signals that become increasingly readable with deliberate attention over time. We begin with the face. Paul Ekman, the psychologist whose decades of cross-cultural research on facial expression informed much of what we now understand about universal human emotion, identified a category of expression he called microexpressions, involuntary, full-face expressions of genuine emotion that occur in as little as 1/25th of a second. Before the conscious mind can manage or suppress them, these expressions correspond to what Ekman identified as 7 universal emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, contempt, and surprise. They appear across all cultures, all ages, all studied populations, suggesting they are not learned displays but hardwired signals, the emotional truth of the nervous system surfacing before the social self can intervene. Most people miss microexpressions entirely, not because their eyes are not capable of seeing them but because their attention is elsewhere. What allows you to begin catching them is a specific quality of attention, a soft, wide focus rather than a narrow, directed one, looking at the whole face rather than the eyes specifically, being present enough that a quarter-second flash of genuine feeling registers before it is gone. The body offers slower, more sustained signals. The orientation of the torso in conversation, whether it is angled toward you or slightly away, is a reliable indicator of genuine engagement or its absence, and it is largely unconscious. People turn their bodies toward what interests them and away from what they want to leave. The feet, which are furthest from conscious control, are often the most honest part of the body in this regard. A person whose words say they are engaged but whose feet are already pointed toward the door is telling you something their words are not. Crossed arms are not always defensiveness. A person looking away is not always disinterested. No single signal is a verdict. What you are reading is clusters, patterns of signals that appear together, and that shift as the emotional content of a conversation shifts. Single data point is interesting. A pattern is meaning. The voice deserves more attention than most people give it. Strip away the words entirely and listen only to the voice, its pace, its pitch, the evenness or unevenness of its rhythm, the places where it tightens or flattens or rises in ways that are slightly out of register with the content being delivered. The voice under stress loses its natural variability. It becomes slightly mechanical, controlled, effortful. The voice in genuine warmth softens and slows. The voice in suppressed emotion sometimes goes very still, a flatness that is not disengagement but containment. And then there is silence, the pauses that the emotionally intelligent person has learned to treat not as gaps to be filled but as information to be heard. There is the pause before an answer. That contains hesitation. The person is deciding something, editing something, choosing between what they want to say and what they feel safe saying. There is the pause after an emotional disclosure. That is simply the person landing in the weight of what they have just said. There is the pause that is an invitation, a breath of space that says, I have more if you have room for it. The instinct of most people in these silences is to speak, to fill the space, to offer reassurance or response or the next question. The emotionally intelligent response is frequently to wait, to let the silence hold, to communicate through your stillness that you are not rushed, not uncomfortable, not moving on, that there is room, that whatever comes next is welcome. Very often, what comes in the space after that stillness is the thing the person most needed to say, the thing that was waiting underneath everything else for someone patient enough to leave the door open. Part 5. The skill that changes everything. Of all the components of emotional intelligence, there is one that has the most consistent, most documented impact on the quality of human relationships. Not empathy, though empathy is essential, not the ability to read nonverbal signals, though that matters enormously. It is self-awareness, the capacity to know with accuracy and without defense what you yourself are feeling and how that feeling is shaping your perception, your behavior, and your impact on the people around you. This might seem counterintuitive in a conversation about reading other people, but the research is unambiguous. The accuracy with which you can perceive the emotional states of others is directly limited by your ability to perceive your own, because the primary instrument through which you read another person's emotions is your own emotional body. You recognize what you see in others by resonating with it in yourself, and if your access to your own emotional experience is limited, if you have learned, through years of conditioning, to suppress, intellectualize, minimize, or simply not notice what you are feeling, then your instrument for reading others is poorly tuned. You will miss what you have trained yourself not to feel. You cannot hear in others what you have learned to silence in yourself. The psychologist Daniel Goleman, who popularized the concept of emotional intelligence, in his landmark 1995 book, identified self-awareness as the foundational competency, the one on which all others rest, and what the research shows about how people develop it is both humbling and hopeful. Humbling because genuine self-awareness is rarer than most people assume. Studies suggest that while 95% of people believe themselves to be self-aware, only about 10 to 15% actually are, by any measurable standard, hopeful. Because it is entirely developable through specific, consistent practice. The practice is this: slow down the moment between stimulus and response, between what happens and what you do about it. In that moment, which is often a fraction of a second, which is why developing access to it requires deliberate training. Ask, what am I feeling right now? Not what do I think, not what should I do. What am I actually feeling in my body in this moment? The specificity of emotional labeling matters more than most people realize. Research by psychologist Matthew Lieberman has shown that the act of labeling an emotion, putting a precise word to what you feel, not just good or bad but specifically what, reduces the activation of the amygdala, the brain's threat response center, and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with considered decision-making. Numbing the feeling does not just describe your state, it changes it. It moves you from being inside the emotion to being the observer of it. And from that observer position, your choices expand considerably. There is a second practice that builds on this. When you are in conversation and you Notice something in yourself, a defensiveness, a pulling away, an inexplicable irritation or unexpected warmth toward what someone is saying. Treat that signal as information, not as noise to be managed. As data, your emotional system has noticed something your conscious mind has not yet caught up to. Your job is to become curious about it rather than reactive to it. The emotionally intelligent person in conversation is doing something quite complex. They are attending to the other person's verbal content, reading the nonverbal second conversation, tracking their own emotional responses as a source of information about what is actually happening between them, and making ongoing, moment-to-moment choices about how to respond in ways that serve genuine connection rather than ego protection. It sounds exhausting described that way. In practice, developed to fluency over time, it does not feel like effort. It feels like being awake, fully, quietly, receptively awake in the presence of another person. And that quality of wakefulness, the presence that makes another person feel genuinely seen, genuinely heard, genuinely met, is perhaps the most profound gift one human being can offer another. Not advice, not solutions, not the perfectly chosen words. Presence, the rare, unmistakable sense that you are actually here with them, that their experience in this moment has your full attention, that you are not in a hurry to get past it. The closing. Every person you will meet today is carrying something they have not fully said out loud. Worry they have been sitting with alone, a grief that has not had enough space, a hope they have been afraid to name because numbing it makes it real enough to lose, an exhaustion that goes deeper than the surface explanation they will give you if you ask how they are. Most people will move through their day without truly encountering this. They will have transactions where they meant to have conversations. They will give advice where they were asked underneath the asking, simply to be heard. They will miss the pause that held the real thing because they were already composing their response. You now know something about why that happens. The two conversations, the drifting mind, the self-focused listening that masquerades as connection, the empathy confused with sympathy, the silences mistaken for gaps, the self-awareness that has to precede the awareness of others. You know what the second conversation looks like, carried in faces that flash the truth for a fraction of a second, in bodies that orient toward or away from what they mean, in voices that go slightly still around the things that matter most, in silences that hold what words have not yet formed. And you know the practice that makes all of this accessible, not a technique to be deployed strategically, a way of being with other people, an orientation of genuine curiosity. Not about what they will say next, but about what it is actually like to be them. A quality of attention that communicates without words that you are here, that you have time, that what they carry is worth your full presence. Emotional intelligence is not a skill that makes you better at navigating people. It is a skill that makes you more human in the presence of them. The people in your life who have made you feel most understood, think about them for a moment. What they gave you was not solutions or perfectly chosen words. It was the experience of being seen, of mattering enough to someone's full attention that you left the conversation feeling less alone than when you arrived. That is the gift, and it is one that you can learn to give. Not perfectly, not all the time. Human attention wanders, human presence is imperfect. But the direction of travel toward genuine seeing, toward hearing what is not said, toward bringing your full self into contact with someone else's full self rather than the managed versions you both present, that direction changes everything it touches. The next conversation you have will be two conversations. You now know how to listen to both.